My name is Jocelyn. I am 34 years old. My parents invited me over for what was supposed to be a cozy holiday dinner. But when I walked through the front doors of their home, there was no smell of roasting turkey. There was no festive music playing. Instead, 22 of my relatives were sitting in a massive circle in the silent living room staring at me. In the very center of that circle was one single empty chair. My mother stood up, crossed her arms, and said, "We all agree you are the problem." I did not cry. I simply took the chair, listened to their insults for exactly 30 minutes, and then I played a 3-year-old audio recording that made all 22 of them run for the door. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart toxic family members who thought they could destroy you. Let me take you back to that exact moment. I pushed open the heavy oak double doors of my parents' sprawling Illinois suburb home. I had just come straight from my office in downtown Chicago. I work as a forensic accountant for a Big Four firm. My entire career is built around analyzing complex financial data, tracking hidden offshore assets, and sniffing out corporate fraud. I am incredibly used to walking into highly hostile environments where guilty people try to intimidate me. But nothing quite prepares you for the chilling visual of your entire bloodline waiting in the shadows to ambush you. The massive living room was completely dead silent. All the expensive furniture had been pushed aggressively against the walls to make space. My aunts, uncles, and cousins were arranged in a tight, suffocating ring of folding chairs. No one smiled. No one offered to take my coat or ask about my drive. The tension in the air was so thick and heavy it felt genuinely hard to breathe. The single empty wooden chair sat dead in the middle of the expensive Persian rug. It looked exactly like a police interrogation room that had been poorly masked as a family holiday gathering. They thought they had trapped me, but they had actually just locked themselves in with me. My mother. Patricia stepped forward from the edge of the circle. She was wearing her signature expensive cashmere sweater, her face set in a hard, unforgiving mask of pure judgment. She did not say hello. She did not offer a warm embrace. She simply folded her arms tightly over her chest, looked down her nose at me, and delivered the opening blow with zero hesitation. "Sit down, Jocelyn. There is no party tonight. We called you here because we all agree that you are the problem in this family." A collective low murmur of agreement rippled through the 22 people surrounding us. They were watching me like hawks. They were waiting for me to break down. They fully expected the old version of me to appear. They wanted the desperate daughter who used to constantly crave their conditional approval, the weak girl who would have immediately started apologizing, crying, and begging to know what she did wrong to upset them. But I am not that weak girl anymore. I did not shed a single tear. I did not even let my breathing change rhythm. I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me sweat. Instead, I looked down at my wrist. I deliberately tapped the glowing face of my gold Cartier watch, a very expensive gift I bought for myself after securing my last major corporate promotion. I looked back up at my mother, maintaining absolute, unwavering eye contact. I slowly unbuttoned my heavy wool winter coat, sliding it gracefully off my shoulders and draping it neatly over my left arm. I walked right past her, making my way directly to the center of the room. My designer heels clicked sharply against the polished hardwood floor, echoing loudly in the dead silence. I sat down on that empty wooden chair, crossed my legs elegantly, and rested my hands in my lap. I looked slowly around the circle, making absolutely sure to meet the eyes of every single aunt, uncle, and cousin who dared to judge me today. I gave them a cold, polite, corporate smile. "You have a very captive audience, Mother," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. "But I have a highly confidential global strategy meeting on Zoom in exactly 45 minutes, so whoever is leading this little prosecution today, I highly suggest you start talking right now." Aunt Susan took the bait first. She leaned forward in her metal folding chair so fast it squeaked aggressively against the polished wood floor. Susan considered herself the moral compass of the family, despite having filed for bankruptcy twice. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. Your attitude is exactly why we are all here, Jocelyn. She snapped, her voice trembling with manufactured outrage. You sit up in your fancy downtown Chicago apartment looking down on all of us. You think your prestigious corporate title makes you better than your own flesh and blood. Uncle Greg immediately chimed in from across the circle, nodding vigorously. He crossed his arms over his flannel shirt, glaring at me. It is disgusting, he added loudly. We raised you to care about family, but the second you started making six figures, you turned your back on us. You are a heartless, selfish elitist. The floodgates were open. Susan and Greg firing the opening shots emboldened the rest of the relatives to join the firing squad. Voices overlapped in a chaotic, suffocating chorus of disapproval. Cousin Brittany muttered loudly about how I never bothered to attend the kids' birthday parties. Aunt Diane complained I had the audacity to wear designer clothes while the rest of them struggled daily with inflation. But the central theme of their collective fury constantly circled back to one specific person. My older sister, Amanda. Amanda was 36 years old and the undisputed golden child of our household. She sat right next to my mother, dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue, playing the fragile victim perfectly. Look at your sister, Susan, demanded, her voice rising an octave. Just look at her. Amanda is suffering. She has been through pure hell trying to start a family with Terrence. And what do? You sit on your corporate money and watch her cry. The room grew significantly louder as the accusations intensified, targeting the IVF treatments. For the past 3 years, Amanda loudly and publicly struggled with fertility issues. It was the only conversation topic allowed at every family gathering. Susan stood up, completely ignoring my firm request for brevity. You knew Amanda needed $40,000 for her next round of IVF treatments, Susan yelled, pointing at me again. You know Terrence works hard, but they are drowning in medical debt. We all know you have the money, Jocelyn. We know all about your recent promotion and your massive bonuses. But when your own sister came begging for financial help so she could finally become a mother, you slammed the door right in her face. You refused to help bring a new innocent life into this family. What kind of monster does that? What kind of cruel woman denies her sister the right to be a mother just to buy an expensive watch? The mob mentality was fully activated and incredibly suffocating. The 22 people in the room fed off each other's toxic energy, working themselves into a state of absolute self-righteous hysteria. Disgraceful, someone muttered from the back row. Completely toxic, another voice echoed in agreement. They painted a horrifying picture of me as a greedy villain hoarding wealth while the sweet, innocent Princess Amanda languished in despair. They demanded to know how I slept at night, aggressively questioning my morals and my fundamental humanity. My mother, Patricia, simply sat there watching the execution with a look of smug satisfaction on her face. She orchestrated this entire ambush, beautifully weaponizing the extended family into her personal army of guilt and shame. They genuinely believed they were conducting a noble, necessary intervention to save my corrupted soul and force me to finally do the right thing. I did not interrupt them once. I did not raise my hand in defense or try to frantically explain my financial decisions. I sat perfectly still in my wooden chair, breathing evenly and maintaining my polite corporate smile. In my line of work as a forensic accountant, the best thing you can do when suspects are panicking is to let them talk. The more they talk, the deeper they dig their own graves. People who lie always overcompensate with highly aggressive emotions. I watched Amanda bury her face in her hands, pretending to sob while subtly peeking through her fingers to gauge my reaction. I watched Uncle Greg puff out his chest, feeling righteous. And most importantly, I watched my brother-in-law, Terrence. He sat quietly beside Amanda, his jaw clenched tight, staring at the floor, buying into their false narrative. I let the relatives shout for another 10 minutes, absorbing every insult. I let them firmly establish their moral high ground, because I knew exactly how hard they were about to fall. I watched Aunt Susan wipe a completely dry tear from her cheek. She was putting on an incredible performance, desperately trying to guilt-trip me into submission. It really breaks my heart. Jocelyn, Susan whimpered, pressing a hand over her chest. It breaks my heart to see how much you hate your own sister. I let her finish her sentence before I finally decided it was time to speak. I uncrossed my legs, planted my feet firmly on the floor, and leaned slightly forward. "Aunt Susan," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy tension in the room like a scalpel. "That is a truly beautiful sweater you are wearing." Susan blinked rapidly, clearly thrown off by the sudden change in topic. She glanced down at her chest. "Thank you," she stammered defensively. "Amanda bought it for me last month for my birthday. She is always so thoughtful." "Yes, she certainly is," I agreed, nodding slowly. "It is a Gucci cashmere blend. Retails for exactly $1,200. I saw it at the boutique on Michigan Avenue just last week." Susan puffed out her chest a little bit, looking rather pleased with herself. "See, Jocelyn," she said triumphantly. "Amanda understands the true value of family. She gives even when she has nothing." I smiled, but it did not reach my eyes. "That is the interesting part, Susan," I said, dropping my voice slightly. "Amanda supposedly has absolutely nothing. She is drowning in medical debt, as you so loudly pointed out. So tell me, Susan, how exactly does a woman who cannot afford her own medical bills casually drop $1,200 on a luxury sweater for her aunt?" The entire room went dead silent. The suffocating chorus of accusations completely dried up. I turned my attention directly to Amanda. She was no longer pretending to cry. Her hands were gripping the edges of her metal folding chair so tightly, her knuckles were completely white. 2 years ago, I continued addressing the entire room, but keeping my eyes locked on Amanda. 2 years ago, Amanda came to my apartment in Chicago. She sat on my couch and cried for 3 hours straight. She told me her insurance had completely stopped covering her fertility treatments. She said she needed exactly $40,000 for one final round of IVF, or her dream of becoming a mother was completely over. A low murmur went through the relatives. They all knew this story. They all believed it. And what did I do? I asked the room rhetorically. I wrote her a check, a certified cashier's check for exactly $40,000. I handed it to her. No questions asked, no repayment required. Gasps echoed around the circle. Several aunts and uncles looked completely stunned. They clearly had no idea I had actually given Amanda any money at all. Patricia, my mother, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Jocelyn, do not try to change the narrative," Patricia barked. "You gave her that money years ago. We are talking about her current struggles." "Oh, but we are talking about her current struggles, Mother," I replied, my voice dripping with cold authority. "Because I am a forensic accountant. I do not just give away $40,000 without eventually noticing where it goes." I looked back at Amanda. Her breathing was becoming shallow and rapid. "Amanda, tell the family what you did with that $40,000 check I gave you for your medical bills." She refused to speak, staring down at her lap, her face flushed bright red. "Since you seem to have lost your voice, I will tell them," I said, leaning back in my chair. "You did not go to a fertility clinic, Amanda. You did not pay off medical debt. You marched straight down to the luxury auto dealership in Naperville. That $40,000 was not used to bring a child into this world. It was used as the exact down payment on that brand new silver Porsche Panamera currently parked in the driveway outside." The silence in the room was absolute and deafening. You could have heard a pin drop. Uncle Greg stared at me, his mouth slightly open. Aunt Susan looked down at her expensive Gucci sweater as if it had suddenly caught fire. The relatives who had just spent the last 20 minutes screaming at me for being a heartless monster were now staring at Amanda in complete and utter disbelief. The golden child facade had just cracked wide open. The crushing silence did not last long. The illusion of my sister being a fraud was simply too much for the family ecosystem to accept, and someone had to forcefully correct the narrative before it shattered completely. That someone was Terrence. My brother-in-law pushed his folding chair back so violently it tipped over and crashed against the hardwood floor. Terrence was an imposing figure. He was a tall, athletic African-American man who worked as a highly successful marketing director for a major tech firm. He was used to commanding boardrooms and shutting down dissenting opinions with his sheer physical presence and booming voice. He took 2 large steps forward, deliberately placing his massive frame physically between me and Amanda, acting as the ultimate shield for his seemingly fragile wife. "That is an absolute lie!" Jocelyn Terrence snapped, his deep voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You are making things up just to humiliate her in front of everyone." He pointed a large finger directly at my chest, his face twisted with a mixture of anger and disgust. "I will not stand here and let you slander my wife in front of her own family. You think because you wear a fancy watch and play with spreadsheets all day that you know everything about our lives. You know absolutely nothing." Terrence was practically vibrating with righteous indignation. He looked around the circle of relatives, making sure everyone was paying close attention to him before he delivered what he believed was the ultimate mic drop to destroy my credibility. "I bought that Porsche for Amanda," he declared proudly, his chest puffed out. "I went to the Naperville dealership myself. I negotiated the price and I put down the down payment using my own year-end corporate bonus. I did it because my wife deserved something beautiful after the absolute hell she had been through." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, perfectly selling the image of the devoted, grieving husband. He looked back at me, his eyes narrowing with deep contempt. "You have the nerve to sit there and talk about her medical debt while completely ignoring why she was in the hospital in the first place. She had a severe miscarriage, Jocelyn. We lost our baby. She was completely broken, slipping into a deep, dark depression, and I wanted to give her something luxurious to help her smile again. And here you are trying to twist my gift into some sick narrative about her stealing your money." The relatives immediately softened at the mention of the miscarriage. Aunt Susan let out an audible gasp of sympathy and clutched her chest again. Uncle Greg nodded solemnly, looking at Terrence with deep respect. The mob mentality that I had briefly derailed was now roaring back to life, fueled by Terrence and his emotional defense. He was putting on a masterclass in marketing, pivoting the conversation away from cold, hard numbers and drowning it in heavy emotional trauma. Terrence turned his attention back to me and decided to get incredibly personal. He leaned down slightly, bringing his face closer to mine, his tone dripping with absolute disdain. "You are cold, Jocelyn," he sneered. "You are a cold, calculated, deeply jealous woman. You sit alone in your pristine apartment with your money and your corporate titles, but you have no one. You do not know what it means to actually love someone enough to sacrifice for them. You do not know what it means to build a life with a partner and support them through the darkest moments of their life. You see Amanda and me fighting for our family, and it makes you sick with jealousy. So you fabricate these insane forensic accounting conspiracy theories to tear her down. You cannot stand the fact that despite our struggles, we have real love, and you have nothing but a bank account." I listened to every single word he said without breaking eye contact. I watched the vein pulsing in his thick neck. I watched the fierce protective anger burning in his eyes. And in that precise moment, I realized something incredibly pathetic. Terrence was not lying. At least he did not believe he was lying. As a forensic accountant, I am highly trained to spot micro-expressions of deceit during audits. Terrence displayed absolutely none. His anger was completely genuine. His defense of his wife was authentic. He genuinely believed that his hard-earned corporate bonus had paid for that silver Porsche. He genuinely believed he was the hero of this story, protecting his traumatized wife from her evil, wealthy sister. He was totally unaware that the woman he was fiercely protecting had completely fabricated his entire financial reality. He was just another blind pawn on Amanda and my mother's chessboard. I slowly leaned back in my wooden chair, interlacing my fingers. The entire room was glaring at me now, fully convinced by Terrence's passionate speech. My mother was smiling again, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips as she patted Amanda's knee affectionately. They thought Terrence had successfully shut me down. They thought his emotional outburst had completely invalidated my claim about the $40,000 check, but Terrence had just handed me the exact key I needed to dismantle his entire marriage. I did not raise my voice to match Terrence's volume. I did not stand up or mirror his aggressive posture. I simply looked at him. I let the absolute certainty of my gaze strip away the bluster of his defense. When you are a forensic accountant, you learn that anger is usually just fear wearing a loud mask. Terrence was terrified of looking foolish, and he was overcompensating wildly. I waited until his heavy breathing slowed down slightly, and the echoes of his passionate speech faded into the oppressive silence of the living room. Then I dropped my hands into my lap and tilted my head, speaking with a chilling, almost sympathetic softness. "Are you absolutely sure that was your bonus, Terrence?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm, cutting through the tension like a razor. He blinked, his defensive posture faltering for a fraction of a second. "Of course I am sure," he scoffed, crossing his massive arms over his chest. "I negotiated the deal myself. I signed the paperwork." I smiled a very thin, tight smile. "Yes, you negotiated the price of the car," I agreed smoothly. "But I am asking about the money itself. The $40,000 that mysteriously appeared in your joint checking account right before you went to the dealership. You assumed it was the direct deposit from your corporate bonus, right?" I paused, letting the question hang heavily in the air. "When was the last time you checked the statements on your secondary credit line, Terrence? Not your main credit card. The secondary line of credit you opened 3 years ago when you two were planning to buy a house." Terrence's arms slowly uncrossed. The confident, arrogant set of his jaw vanished, replaced by a sudden dawning confusion. He opened his mouth to answer, but nothing came out. The precision of my question, the exact reference to a specific secondary credit line, was not something you could simply brush off as a jealous fabrication. It was too detailed. It was too accurate. And the way I said it, with the cold detachment of a professional auditor, hit him exactly where he lived as a man who prided himself on controlling his household finances. Amanda immediately recognized the danger. Her survival instinct kicked in with terrifying speed. She lunged forward in her folding chair, her face pale and her voice shrill with genuine panic. "Stop it, Jocelyn," she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "Stop trying to confuse him. Terrence, do not listen to her. She is just trying to deflect because she knows she is a horrible, selfish person." Amanda grabbed Terrence's arm, tugging on his sleeve frantically. "She is crazy, Terrence. She is literally making things up to ruin our marriage because she is jealous of what we have. Please tell her to shut up." But Terrence did not tell me to shut up. He did not even look at his wife. He was staring intensely at me, his brow furrowed, his mind racing through his financial history. The seed of paranoia had been successfully planted, and it was already sprouting rapidly. Terrence was a smart man. He ran marketing budgets worth millions of dollars. He was not an idiot. He was simply blinded by love and grief. But now a glaring mathematical inconsistency had been forcefully shoved into his face, and his professional instincts were waking up. He slowly pulled his arm away from Amanda's desperate grasp. His eyes never left mine. "What do you mean, my secondary credit line?" he asked, his voice significantly lower and stripped of all its previous bravado. Amanda let out a strangled sob, throwing her hands over her face. "Mom, tell her to stop!" Amanda wailed, turning to our mother for protection. "This is supposed to be an intervention for her, not an attack on me." Patricia immediately jumped into action, sensing that her carefully constructed ambush was rapidly falling apart. "Jocelyn, that is quite enough!" Patricia barked, standing up and stepping toward the center of the circle. "You are out of line. You do not interrogate your brother-in-law about his private finances. This is exactly the kind of toxic behavior we called you here to address. You deflect blame and attack the people who are suffering the most. You are a cold, calculating manipulator, and we are absolutely sick of it." Patricia turned to Terrence, placing a comforting hand on his broad shoulder. "Do not let her get into your head, Terrence. You know who she is. You know what she is capable of. She is just trying to tear you and Amanda apart." I leaned back in my chair, perfectly unbothered by my mother's aggressive interruption. I had achieved exactly what I set out to do. I did not need to press the issue further right now. The doubt was there, living and breathing in Terrence's mind. He would check his phone. He would log into his banking app. He would pull those statements. It was only a matter of time before the foundation of his entire reality crumbled completely. I gave Terrence a slow, knowing nod, acknowledging his silent realization. "Check your statements, Terrence," I said softly under the noise of my mother's scolding. "Then we can talk about who is really fabricating a narrative." Terrence had gone completely silent, his eyes fixed intensely on the screen of his smartphone, his thumbs flying rapidly as he logged into his banking portal. The energy in the living room had shifted dangerously away from me and directly toward Amanda. The firing squad was confused and beginning to fracture. That was unacceptable to the architect of this ambush. My father Richard finally decided he could no longer sit on the sidelines. He had to intervene before Terrence discovered the truth, and the entire intervention collapsed. Richard stood up slowly, intentionally straightening the lapels of his expensive custom-tailored suit. My father was a man who commanded absolute authority. He was the family patriarch, the financial compass, and the primary reason my grandfather had entrusted him to manage the massive family trust. He cleared his throat loudly, a deep, booming sound that instantly silenced the murmuring relatives and drew every single eye in the room to him. He looked around the circle, his expression a perfect mixture of profound disappointment and stern warning. "This is exactly what she wants," he announced, his voice dripping with condescension. "Look at what she is doing to us. Look at how quickly she has turned this family against itself with a few highly calculated lies." He pointed a steady finger directly at me. "Jocelyn has always been a master of deflection. We call her here out of love to address her severe selfishness, and within 20 minutes, she is actively trying to destroy her sister's marriage to distract us from her own profound moral failings. We will not allow her to manipulate us like this." The relatives immediately fell back into line, nodding in solemn agreement. Uncle Greg glared at me again, his brief moment of doubt instantly erased by my father's commanding presence. Richard paced slowly around the inner edge of the circle, making sure his words carried the weight of his authority. He was strategically using his role as the ultimate provider to reassert control over the narrative. He stopped pacing and stood tall, his chest puffed out slightly. Tonight was supposed to be a beautiful occasion. Richard continued, his tone shifting from stern to deeply emotional. Tonight was not just a holiday gathering. Tonight was supposed to be the culmination of decades of hard work and careful financial stewardship. He paused, letting the anticipation build in the dead silent room. "As you all know, my father, your grandfather worked his entire life to build something for this family. He created a trust to ensure that every single one of you would be taken care of. And as the appointed manager of that trust, I am incredibly proud to announce that the final maturation date is officially today." A collective gasp of excitement swept through the circle of relatives. Aunt Susan clutched her chest again, this time with genuine, overwhelming joy. Cousin Brittany let out a high-pitched squeal. The tension in the room instantly evaporated, replaced by sheer, unadulterated greed. Richard held up his hands, gesturing for calm, playing the benevolent king perfectly. "Yes," he smiled broadly. "Tonight, right here at midnight, I will be officially dispersing the remaining funds from the family trust to all 22 beneficiaries sitting in this room. The total amount is exactly $4 million. The room erupted. People began clapping and cheering. Several aunts hugged each other with tears in their eyes, already mentally spending their massive windfall. Richard let them celebrate for exactly 30 seconds before his face hardened again, and he turned his full attention back to me. He used the immense power of the impending $4 million payout as a weapon to utterly crush any lingering sympathy the relatives might have had for me. He had effectively bought their absolute loyalty and their unmitigated rage. "This is the family you are destroying, Jocelyn," Richard bellowed, his voice echoing over the cheers. This is the family that is about to share $4 million to pay off mortgages, send kids to college, and finally retire in peace. And while we are celebrating our shared legacy, you are sitting there hoarding your corporate salary and actively plotting to ruin your sister's life with completely fabricated financial conspiracy theories. It is sick, it is deeply disgusting, and we will not tolerate it anymore. The mob mentality snapped back into place, instantly stronger and far more vicious than before. The relatives, fortified by the promise of their impending wealth, turned their collective fury back onto me. "How dare you try to ruin tonight?" Aunt Susan spat, her face flushed red with anger. "You should be ashamed of yourself," Uncle Greg yelled, standing up from his chair. The suffocating chorus of insults began again, far louder and more aggressive. They were desperate to prove their loyalty to Richard, the man holding the checkbook. They needed me to be the villain to justify their own greed. Richard had masterfully weaponized the family trust to completely isolate me and prepare the ground for his final devastating demand. He stared at me, a cold, victorious glint in his eye, fully believing he had already won. Richard did not blink as he took 2 deliberate steps toward my chair. The living room was still buzzing with the greedy excitement of the remaining relatives, but his focus was entirely on me. He reached his right hand inside the breast pocket of his custom-tailored blazer. He pulled out a thick, perfectly folded stack of legal-size paper. He dropped it directly onto my lap with a heavy, dismissive thud. The crisp white pages landed against my skirt, carrying the undeniable weight of a formal legal contract. I did not immediately reach for it. I simply looked down at the bold black text printed across the very top page. It was a formal relinquishment of beneficiary rights. It was a legally binding document designed to completely erase someone from a trust distribution. I looked back up at my father. His jaw was set tight, his eyes completely devoid of any parental warmth. "Since you are so deeply concerned about your sisters' financial well-being," Richard announced, his voice carrying effortlessly across the room, "I have decided to give you the perfect opportunity to finally step up and act like a real sister. At midnight tonight, the $4 million trust will be divided equally among the 8 primary beneficiaries and the 14 extended cousins. Your specific individual share, as dictated by your grandfather, is exactly $500,000. A collective gasp rippled through the folding chairs. Even in this affluent family, a $500,000 lump sum was a massive amount of cash. Aunt Susan leaned forward so far she nearly fell out of her seat, her eyes wide with shock. Richard pointed a rigid finger down at the document resting on my lap. "That document," he explained loudly, making sure every single relative heard him, "is a legally binding transfer of assets. I had my corporate attorneys draft it up specifically for you this morning. It states that you voluntarily renounce your entire $500,000 share of the family trust. Furthermore, it states that your abandoned share will be immediately and irrevocably transferred directly into a private account entirely controlled by your sister Amanda." He said it with such absolute conviction, as if demanding $500,000 from his own daughter was the most natural, logical thing in the world. He was literally attempting to legally extort me in front of 22 witnesses under the guise of family duty. "Amanda needs this money." Richard continued, his tone suddenly shifting to sound like a desperate protective father pleading with a stubborn child. "You have seen the toll this year has taken on her. She is drowning in medical debt. Her marriage is under immense strain. She is suffering, Jocelyn. You, on the other hand, have a prestigious career. You have a luxury apartment in Chicago. You have an investment portfolio and a closet full of designer clothes. You do not need this $500,000. You are single and you have absolutely zero dependents. Amanda has an entire family to save. If you have even an ounce of decency left in your cold heart, you will pick up a pen and sign that document right now. You will transfer your inheritance to your sister to save her marriage and pay off her debts. It is the least you can do for us." He reached back into his blazer pocket and pulled out a heavy gold Mont Blanc pen. He clicked it open and held it out, hovering it right in front of my face. He was towering over me, attempting to use his physical size and the overwhelming peer pressure of the entire room to force my hand. He genuinely expected me to take the pen. He expected me to be so completely broken by the public humiliation and the threat of familial exile that I would blindly sign away my grandfather's money just to buy back their fake affection. The sheer audacity of the demand was almost impressive. As a forensic accountant, I have seen corrupt executives attempt to steal money using massive complex offshore shell companies. But watching my own father try to execute a $500,000 daylight robbery right in his own living room, using nothing but emotional manipulation, was a completely different level of greed. I stared at the heavy gold pen hovering just inches from my face. I did not reach for it at all. I did not. I did not flinch or break eye contact. I just let the deafening silence stretch out, letting his extended arm hover very awkwardly in the cold air as the suffocating tension in the living room skyrocketed to a highly dangerous and truly permanent breaking point tonight, right here before my eyes, as everyone eagerly watched me decide my own fate, completely alone right now. The deafening silence broke when Uncle Greg started clapping. It was a slow, deliberate applause that quickly spread around the suffocating circle of folding chairs. Aunt Susan joined in, nodding vigorously, her eyes shining with absolute righteous validation. Cousin Brittany began clapping too, and soon the entire living room was filled with the sickening sound of 22 relatives applauding my father's blatant attempt at financial extortion. They actually believed this was a brilliant and deeply moral solution to the family crisis. Richard kept the heavy gold pen hovering right in front of my face, his expression smug and victorious, as the mob of relatives began to loudly justify the theft of my inheritance. "It is the absolute least you can do, Jocelyn," Uncle Greg yelled over the applause. "You have a beautiful luxury apartment and a massive corporate salary. You do not even have a husband or any children to feed. What on earth do you possibly need $500,000 for? You are just hoarding wealth while your own flesh and blood is drowning in debt." Aunt Susan immediately jumped in, her voice shrill and entirely devoid of any actual empathy. "He is right, Jocelyn. You are a completely single woman with zero real responsibilities. Amanda is trying to build a family. She is trying to be a mother. You have absolutely no idea what it costs to raise a child in this economy. You sit in your downtown Chicago high-rise buying designer bags and expensive watches while your sister suffers. Signing that paper is the only way you will ever earn your way back into this family." The psychological pressure was immense and highly calculated. They were weaponizing my single status against me, using my independence and professional success as undeniable proof of my supposed moral corruption. Voices began to overlap in a chaotic wave of relentless verbal abuse. Aunt Diane shouted from the back that I was a heartless elitist. Cousin Tyler muttered that I was a greedy corporate sociopath who only cared about spreadsheets and bank balances. They were desperately trying to break my spirit, using their sheer numbers to create an incredibly claustrophobic environment of pure shame and extreme guilt. Every single person in that room was projecting their own financial insecurities directly onto me. Richard did not say a word to stop them. He simply stood tall over me, letting his extended arm hover in the air, allowing his personal army of relatives to do all the dirty work for him. He wanted me to feel entirely isolated. He wanted me to look around that massive room and realize that absolutely no one was coming to save me. Amanda played her part perfectly. She let out a soft, pathetic little sob and buried her face into Terrence's shoulder. "Oh, Dad, please do not force her," Amanda whimpered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I do not want her money if it is going to make her hate me even more. I just want my sister back." It was an absolutely masterful performance of pure martyrdom. By pretending to refuse the money, Amanda instantly fueled the mob's rage to an entirely new level. "How dare you make her beg you?" Aunt Susan screamed, standing up from her chair. Her face flushed a deep, angry red. "Look at what you are doing to her, Jocelyn. You are torturing your own sister. Take the damn pen and sign the paper right now. Just sign it and prove you are not the selfish monster we all know you are. The insults rained down on me from every single direction. It was a relentless physical assault of pure noise and toxic aggression. They called me arrogant. They called me cold. They called me a complete disgrace to my grandfather's memory. They demanded that I pay my dues. They told me that family requires massive sacrifice, and because I had chosen a career over a husband, I owed them this specific financial penalty. They genuinely believed that by bullying me into giving up $500,000, they were executing some form of divine familial justice. They thought they were the good guys fighting a noble crusade to save the golden child from the evil, wealthy spinster sister. I sat perfectly still in the center of the storm. I did not flinch when Uncle Greg slammed his fist against his knee. I did not look away when Aunt Susan screamed in my face. I simply looked at the crisp white legal document resting on my lap, and then I looked at the heavy gold pen my father was still holding out to me. The mob was screaming for my total surrender, demanding that I buy my way back into their good graces with a massive financial sacrifice. I finally raised my right hand. The movement was slow and deliberate. As my fingers brushed against the metal of the heavy gold Mont Blanc pen, the deafening roar of the living room instantly began to die down. It was comical how quickly the screaming stopped. Aunt Susan clamped her mouth shut. Uncle Greg lowered his clenched fist. Cousin Brittany leaned forward in her folding chair, her eyes wide with greedy anticipation. They held their breath, convinced they had broken me. They thought the psychological pressure had crushed my defenses. Richard let out a loud, arrogant sigh of relief as I pulled the expensive pen from his grasp. He actually smiled, an expression of pure triumph washing over his face. He stepped back, giving me room to place the tip of the pen onto the signature line of the crisp white legal document resting on my lap. I did not uncap the pen. Instead, I held it horizontally between my index and middle fingers. I slowly began to twirl it. The polished gold caught the warm light of the crystal chandelier, flashing brightly as it spun smoothly over my knuckles. I stared down at the blank signature line on the relinquishment form. The silence in the living room was absolute now. You could hear the ticking of the antique mahogany grandfather clock out in the hallway. I let them wait. I let them marinate in their premature victory for a full 60 seconds. I twirled the pen, feeling its heavy weight, assessing the sheer absurdity of the situation. Then I stopped the spinning motion entirely. I gripped the pen firmly, resting my hand on my knee, and slowly raised my head to look directly at my father. My voice was flat, devoid of any fear or submission when I spoke. "And what exactly happens if I do not sign this?" The question hung in the air like a heavy physical object. The victorious smile vanished from Richard's face, replaced by a sudden flash of profound confusion and immediate anger. He blinked, staring at me as if I had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. Aunt Susan let out a sharp gasp of indignation. "What did you just say?" Susan hissed venomously. Richard took a heavy step forward, his domineering posture returning instantly. "Do not play games with me, Jocelyn," he warned, his voice dropping into a threatening growl. "You are surrounded by your entire family. You do not have a choice here today. You will sign that document right now, or you will be permanently cut off from every single person in this room forever. You will never be welcomed back." I kept my cold eyes locked securely on him. "That is not a threat, Richard," I replied calmly without raising my voice. "That is a highly anticipated vacation. I am asking you what actual leverage you think you have over me. I am a financially independent adult. I do not live under your roof. I do not rely on your trust fund money. So I will ask you one more time. What happens if I refuse to sign away $500,000 right now?" Before Richard could stammer out an angry answer, a cold, sharp voice cut right through the tension. Patricia stepped forward. My mother pushed past Uncle Greg, her cashmere sweater brushing against his arm. She walked into the center of the circle, placing herself right beside my father. She looked down at me, and the fake mask of the heartbroken mother completely fell away. Her face twisted into a deeply malicious, terrifying sneer. Her eyes were dark, calculating, and devoid of any normal maternal warmth. She looked at me not as her daughter, but as an enemy combatant who needed to be destroyed. If you think you can walk out of here without consequences, you are far more arrogant than I thought, Patricia said, her voice dripping with toxic venom. You always thought you were the smartest person in the room. You always thought your fancy forensic accounting degree made you invincible. But you forgot who raised you, Jocelyn. You forgot that I know exactly how to deal with a stubborn, selfish child who refuses to obey. Patricia crossed her arms tightly. You asked what happens if you refuse to sign. She continued, her sneer widening into a terrifying smile. You think the worst thing we can do is stop inviting you to holiday dinners? No, Jocelyn. If you do not put that pen to paper right this second, I am going to make sure you lose your career, your reputation, and your freedom. The entire room fell into a deathly silence at my mother's words. The relatives who had been shouting just moments ago were now holding their breath, staring at Patricia in complete shock. The threat of prison was not something anyone expected at a family holiday gathering. I kept my eyes locked on my mother, waiting for her to play her final desperate card. Patricia took another step closer to me, her designer heels sinking into the expensive Persian rug. 3 years ago, she began, her voice echoing loudly in the massive living room. 3 years ago, exactly $200,000 magically disappeared from the joint retirement account your father and I had spent decades building. It was completely wiped out in a single afternoon. A chorus of gasps erupted from the circle of folding chairs. Aunt Susan covered her mouth with both hands, looking genuinely horrified. Uncle Greg shook his head in disbelief. No one in the extended family knew about this missing money. Patricia had kept it a closely guarded secret until this exact moment, saving it specifically to use as the ultimate weapon against me. And we both know exactly where that money went, do we not? Jocelyn, Patricia continued, her eyes narrowing into cold, dark slits. You thought you were so incredibly clever. You thought your elite forensic accounting skills gave you the power to bypass our bank security protocols without leaving a trace. You thought you could just hack into your own parents' retirement fund, wire $200,000 into an anonymous offshore account, and simply walk away while we suffered. I did not react. I did not vigorously deny the accusation or jump up from my chair in a panic. I just sat there listening to the sheer magnitude of her fabricated story. Patricia turned slightly to look at my father. Richard reached down to a leather briefcase resting on the floor next to his chair. He snapped the brass locks open and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. He held it up for the entire room to see. This folder, Patricia announced, pointing at the thick stack of papers, contains the undeniable proof of your federal crimes. We hired our own private digital investigators. We have the internal bank server logs. We have the traced wire transfers. We have the exact digital footprints proving that the computer used to hack our retirement account was located inside your luxury high-rise apartment in Chicago. The relatives immediately turned their furious glares back onto me. Their outrage was now mixed with a deep, visceral disgust. They genuinely believed I was a criminal mastermind who had robbed her own elderly parents to fund a lavish corporate lifestyle. Cousin Brittany actually scooted her chair back slightly, as if my supposed criminality was a contagious disease. You are a monster, Aunt Diane whispered loudly from the back row. You stole their retirement money. Patricia turned back to me, her malicious sneer returning in full force. She looked down at the relinquishment form still resting perfectly on my lap. So, here is the deal, Jocelyn, she said, her voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. We are a family that believes in second chances. We believe in mercy. We believe in taking care of our own, even when they deeply betray us. If you uncap that gold pen right now and sign away your $500,000 share of the family trust to Amanda, we will consider the $200,000 you stole a closed matter. We will burn this manila folder in the fireplace tonight. We will never speak of your horrific crimes again, and we will allow you to walk out of this house a free woman. She paused, letting the massive weight of the blackmail settle heavily over the silent room. But she warned, taking a deep, dramatic breath. If you refuse to sign that document, if you choose to be greedy and stubborn. Tonight, I promise you that tomorrow morning at exactly 8 o'clock, your father will personally hand-deliver this folder to the Chicago Police Department and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You will be arrested at your fancy corporate office. You will be stripped of your professional accounting license. You will be publicly disgraced in the financial sector, and you will spend the next 10 years of your life rotting in a federal prison for wire fraud and elder financial abuse. Patricia crossed her arms, looking down at me with absolute supreme confidence. She had backed me into what she genuinely believed was an inescapable corner. She had meticulously crafted a scenario where I had to choose between losing $500,000 or losing my entire life. Amanda let out another fake sob, hiding her face against Terrence's chest, pretending to be completely devastated by my supposed criminal actions. Terrence glared at me, his jaw clenched tight, entirely convinced that my mother was telling the absolute truth. The 22 relatives waited in suffocating silence, watching me intensely, fully expecting me to finally break down, cry, and frantically sign the legal document to save myself from federal prison. I let the silence stretch. It was a thick, oppressive silence that felt heavy enough to crush bone. 22 pairs of eyes were locked onto my face. They were waiting for the inevitable crack in my armor. They wanted the tears. They wanted the trembling hands. They wanted to see me drop to my knees and beg my parents for mercy. Patricia stood over me with her arms crossed, her chin tipped up in absolute triumph. Richard gripped the brass handle of his leather briefcase, holding that prop manila folder like it was a loaded weapon. Amanda peeked out from behind Terrence, her tear-stained cheeks glistening under the crystal chandelier, ready to watch my complete destruction. Terrence just looked at me with pure disgust, a man entirely fooled by the masterful performance of the woman he married. I did not give them the tears. I did not give them the trembling hands or the desperate apologies. I slowly lowered the gold Mont Blanc pen, placing it gently onto the crisp, white paper of the relinquishment contract, resting on my lap. I did not throw it. I did not snap it in half. I just set it down with casual indifference. Then I raised my left arm. I pushed back the sleeve of my cashmere sweater and I looked down at the glowing face of my Cartier watch. I stared at the moving second hand for 5 full seconds, letting the quiet ticking of the hallway clock fill the void. "Well," I said, my voice breaking the suffocating silence with a calm conversational tone. "That was certainly an impressive performance." I looked up, meeting my mother's dark, malicious eyes. "But my 30 minutes are officially over." Patricia blinked, her smug smile faltering just a fraction of an inch. "What are you talking about?" Patricia snapped, her voice tight with sudden irritation. "Do not play games with me, Jocelyn. I just handed you a one-way ticket to federal prison and you are looking at your watch. You have 5 seconds to pick up that pen and sign the document before your father calls the police right now." I ignored her completely. I did not even look at the manila folder Richard was brandishing. In the world of forensic accounting, we deal with real evidence, not cheap theatrical props manufactured to scare easily intimidated victims. I knew exactly what was in my parents' retirement accounts because I had already audited their entire financial history. I knew there was no missing $200,000 from their joint savings. It was a complete fabrication designed to force my hand through sheer panic. But they did not know that I knew. They were still operating under the delusion that they held all the cards. I reached into my tailored suit jacket pocket and pulled out my smartphone. The screen illuminated, casting a pale blue light across my face. Uncle Greg took a nervous step forward, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What is she doing?" Greg asked, looking at Richard with sudden apprehension. "Is she calling her lawyer?" "If she calls a lawyer right now, we are done, Richard." "I am not calling a lawyer, Uncle Greg," I replied. My eyes fixed on my phone screen as my thumb swiped smoothly through my applications. "I am simply moving this little intervention into the evidence phase. You all sat here and listened to the prosecution for 30 minutes. You listened to Amanda play the tragic victim. You listened to Terrence defend a massive lie. You listened to my mother threaten me with a fabricated federal crime to extort $500,000 from my inheritance. Now it is time for the defense to present its case. Richard let out a harsh bark of laughter. The defense, he mocked loudly, stepping closer to me, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me into dropping the phone. You have no defense. We have the server logs. We have the digital footprint. You have nothing but your own stubborn arrogance. Put the phone away and sign the paper, Jocelyn, before I ruin your life permanently. I tapped the settings icon on my phone screen. My father loved to brag about the expensive technology he installed in this massive house. He loved showing off the custom-built $4,000 Bose surround sound system that was seamlessly integrated into the ceiling of the living room. It was a state-of-the-art wireless audio setup designed to perfectly amplify rich sound across the entire first floor of the house. He used it to play classical music during his fancy dinner parties to impress his wealthy friends. I was about to use it for something entirely different. I opened my Bluetooth menu. The device named Family Room Audio immediately popped up on my screen. I tapped it. A soft electronic chime echoed from the hidden speakers above our heads, confirming the successful pairing. Patricia looked up at the ceiling, her eyes darting back and forth in sudden, genuine panic. "What did you just do?" she demanded, her voice rising in pitch. "What is that sound?" I locked my phone screen and looked directly at Amanda. Her face had suddenly gone chalk white, realizing that she could no longer control the narrative. "I think it is time we clear up a few financial mysteries," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the massive, silent room. "I think it is time we talk about what actually happened to the money Terrence was saving for your new house, Amanda." I pressed the volume button on the side of my phone, turning it all the way up to maximum capacity. My thumb pressed firmly against the play icon, resting in the center of my smartphone screen. Instantly, the crystal-clear audio from the hidden ceiling speakers flooded the massive living room. The recording did not start with words. It started with the unmistakable sound of violent, hysterical sobbing. It was a wet, desperate, gasping sound that bounced off the expensive mahogany walls and the crystal chandelier. Every single person in the room instantly recognized that voice. It was Amanda. But this was not the quiet, delicate fake crying she had been performing for the last 30 minutes. This was raw, unfiltered, animalistic panic. I watched Terrence flinch as the sound of his wife's recorded sobbing hit his ears. He looked up at the ceiling and then down at Amanda, who was currently frozen in her metal folding chair, looking like she was about to vomit. In the recording, the sobbing continued for a few agonizing seconds before my mother's voice cut through the noise. Patricia sounded annoyed and sharply impatient on the tape. "Stop crying and tell me exactly what happened," Patricia commanded from the ceiling speakers. "You called me over here in the middle of the day, Amanda. What did you do?" A sharp gasp echoed through the room as the recorded version of Amanda finally managed to catch her breath. "Mom, it is gone," Amanda wailed, her recorded voice cracking with sheer terror. "The money is completely gone. I lost it all." On the tape, Patricia demanded to know what money she was talking about. "The house fund," Amanda shrieked. "The $200,000 Terrence has been saving for the last 5 years. It is gone, Mom. Every single penny of it is completely gone." The living room in this present moment descended into absolute paralyzed shock. Aunt Susan let out a strangled gasp. Uncle Greg's jaw practically unhinged. I kept my eyes entirely focused on Terrence. The tall, imposing marketing director looked as though he had just been struck by a high-speed train. The color drained completely from his face, leaving behind a hollow ashen mask. His chest stopped moving. He stopped breathing. He was listening to the brutal destruction of his financial foundation broadcast in high-definition audio. On the tape, my mother sounded genuinely horrified for the first time. "What do you mean it is gone?" Patricia hissed. "How do you lose $200,000 in a single morning, Amanda?" The recorded. Amanda began to hyperventilate. "I invested it," she sobbed frantically. "Someone reached out to me online about a guaranteed cryptocurrency exchange. They said I could double the money in 3 days. I wanted to surprise Terrence. I wired the entire savings account to the trading platform, but when I tried to log back in today, the website was completely gone. It was a scam, Mom. I was scammed and the money is totally gone. The silence in the physical living room was deafening. The illusion of Amanda as the perfect supportive wife shattered into a million pieces right in front of 22 witnesses. She had actively stolen her husband's incredibly hard-earned money and recklessly gambled it away on a completely idiotic crypto scam because of her own blinding greed. Terrence slowly turned his head to look at his wife. The man who had fiercely defended her just minutes ago, the man who had screamed in my face and called me a jealous monster, was now staring at Amanda with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. Amanda could not even look at him. She was staring blankly at her own knees, her hands trembling violently, her breathing shallow and erratic. She knew there was absolutely no way to explain this away. The recording was perfectly clear. "Please, Mom, you have to help me," Amanda begged on the recording, her voice devolving into pathetic whines. "Terrence is going to look at the bank statements on Friday. He will leave me, Mom. He told me how hard he worked for that money. If he finds out I secretly wired it to a fake crypto website, he will absolutely divorce me. You have to help me fix this before he finds out. I cannot lose him, Mom. Him." The 22 relatives sat completely frozen, trapped in a nightmare of their own making. They had gathered here today specifically to crucify me for being selfish and greedy. But instead they were being forced to sit in silence and listen to the undeniable proof that the true villain of the family was sitting right next to my mother. And the recording was not even finished yet. The worst part, the absolute most damning piece of evidence, was just about to play. The audio hissed softly for a brief second before the sound of a heavy wooden door opening echoed from the ceiling speakers. On the recording, you could clearly hear my father Richard walking into the room. "What is going on?" Richard asked on the tape, his voice tight with concern. "Why is Amanda crying like this?" Patricia did not hesitate. "Richard, you need to shut the door right now," Patricia ordered. "Amanda has made a massive mistake. She lost Terrence's house fund, all $200,000 of it. It is gone." On the recording, there was a sharp intake of breath from Richard. I watched the real Richard standing in the living room right now, clutching his prop manila folder, his face completely devoid of color. He looked like a man who was watching his own execution broadcast live on television. On the tape, Amanda began crying harder, repeating her frantic apologies about the crypto scam. But instead of screaming at her, instead of expressing any outrage over her incredible stupidity, Richard immediately shifted into complete damage control. "Stop crying, Amanda," Richard commanded, his recorded voice cold and incredibly pragmatic. "Crying will not get the money back. Terrence will check his accounts on Friday. We have exactly 3 days to replace $200,000 in cash before your marriage is completely destroyed. We cannot take out a loan that quickly. We cannot liquidate our retirement accounts without paying massive penalties. We have to find another source of liquid cash right now." There was a tense silence on the recording. In the physical living room, the 22 relatives leaned forward collectively, holding their breath. They were listening to a criminal conspiracy unfolding in real time. Then my mother's voice broke the recorded silence. Her tone was terrifyingly calm and deeply calculated. "What about the family trust?" Patricia asked. "The trust account has over $4 million sitting in it, Richard. It is totally liquid. You are the sole manager of that account. You control all the disbursements and the quarterly statements. You could easily transfer $200,000 to Amanda's checking account today, and Terrence would never know the difference. He would just see the balance restored." In the present moment, Uncle Greg let out a loud, furious gasp. Aunt Susan grabbed her own hair, her eyes wide with sheer horror. They were finally realizing the true depth of the betrayal. They were realizing that the very people who had gathered them here to lynch me had actually robbed them blind. On the recording, Richard hesitated for only a fraction of a second. "If I pull $200,000 from the trust, the relatives will eventually notice the discrepancy," Richard argued. "It is a massive sum of money, Patricia. When the maturity date arrives and I have to distribute the funds, they are going to ask where that missing money went. They will demand a full audit. That is when my mother delivered the final fatal blow. I stood perfectly still in the center of the living room, watching the faces of my extended family, as Patricia sealed her own fate. "Do not be ridiculous, Richard." Patricia snapped on the tape, her voice dripping with pure malice. "If the relatives ever notice the missing money, we will just frame Jocelyn. She is an auditor. We will spoof her IP address. She has the technical skills to bypass the bank security. We will just tell everyone she hacked the account to fund her luxurious lifestyle. Who are they going to believe? Us or the selfish daughter who never visits them anyway? We will create a fake paper trail and blame the entire theft on her. It is the perfect plan." My thumb pressed the screen of my smartphone. The audio abruptly cut off. The sudden silence that crashed down on the living room was heavier and more suffocating than anything I had ever experienced in my entire life. The crystal-clear digital recording had perfectly captured the exact moment my parents actively conspired to steal from their own family and frame their innocent daughter for a federal crime just to save their golden child from facing the consequences of her own blinding greed. There was no way to spin this. The prop manila folder my father was holding suddenly looked incredibly pathetic. The entire elaborate threat of sending me to federal prison was exposed as a highly calculated smokescreen designed to force me into signing away my inheritance. The 22 relatives who had spent the last 30 minutes hurling vile insults at me were now completely paralyzed. They looked at Richard. They looked at Patricia. The toxic illusion of this family was completely shattered. I watched their eyes widen as the absolute truth finally hit them. The audio stopped, leaving a heavy ringing in the ears of everyone present. For a long, terrifying moment, nobody breathed. The 22 relatives were completely frozen in their metal folding chairs, staring at the space where the digital voices had just exposed the ultimate betrayal. The illusion of the perfect family hierarchy completely shattered into pieces right in front of my eyes. I watched my mother Patricia carefully. The confident, malicious woman who had just threatened to send me to federal prison was entirely gone. Her face turned an unnatural shade of chalk white. She gripped the edges of her cashmere sweater, her chest heaving violently as she began to hyperventilate. She was gasping for air, unable to process the reality that her meticulously planned extortion scheme had just imploded on a spectacular level. She stumbled backward and collapsed heavily into her folding chair, staring blankly at the floor. Uncle Greg was the first to physically react. He slowly stood up from his chair, his hands trembling as he pointed a finger directly at my father. "Richard, what did you do?" Uncle Greg whispered, his voice cracking with a mixture of profound shock and rising fury. Richard did not answer him. My father was trapped in a state of absolute panic. He looked at the prop manila folder in his hands and realized it was now nothing more than a pathetic joke. His eyes darted around the room, seeing the disgusted faces of his siblings and cousins. The unquestioned authority he had commanded just moments ago had completely evaporated. He realized that the only way to stop this nightmare from getting worse was to destroy the physical source of the audio. With a sudden guttural yell, Richard dropped the heavy leather briefcase and lunged wildly across the Persian rug. He threw his massive frame directly toward me, his hands reaching out to snatch my smartphone right from my grasp. He was completely out of his mind, with desperation willing to physically attack his own daughter, to smash the evidence into tiny pieces. I did not even flinch or move out of his way. I knew I did not have to. Before Richard could take 3 full steps, a massive physical barrier slammed right into him. Terrence moved with terrifying speed. The tall, athletic marketing director shot out of his chair, crossing the distance in a fraction of a second. Terrence threw his broad shoulders forward and intercepted my father mid-stride. The impact was loud and violently abrupt. Terrence's large hands gripped Richard's tailored suit jacket, twisting the expensive fabric as he forcefully shoved the older man backward. Richard stumbled clumsily, his expensive dress shoes slipping on the hardwood floor before he crashed heavily against a thick oak side table. "Do not touch her!" Terrence roared, his deep voice vibrating violently through the floorboards. The sheer volume of his shout made several aunts scream and cover their ears in terror. Richard tried to push himself up his face, completely red with embarrassment and boiling rage. "Let me go, Terence," Richard demanded, struggling wildly against the younger man's iron grip. "You do not understand what she is doing. She fabricated that entire audio file. She is lying to you to ruin us." Terence did not let him go. Instead, Terence stepped closer, towering over my father and pinning him firmly against the hard edge of the oak table. The physical difference between the two men was instantly apparent. Richard was an older man used to intimidating people with bank accounts and loud words from behind a desk. Terence was a younger, physically powerful man who had just discovered that his entire marriage was a calculated financial lie orchestrated by the very man he was currently holding by the collar. Terence's chest rose and fell rapidly as he fought desperately to suppress a volcanic level of rage. His knuckles were completely white from gripping Richard's jacket so incredibly tight. "You stole my money," Terence growled, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register that forced everyone in the room to freeze and listen. "You sat at my dining table every single Sunday for the last 3 years, playing the loving, supportive father-in-law. You gave me financial advice. You watched me work 80-hour weeks to rebuild the savings account I thought we lost to bad market investments. And all this time, you and your wife were covering up a massive theft." Richard opened his mouth to lie again, but Terence shoved him hard against the table, cutting him off completely. "Do not speak," Terence commanded, his eyes burning with pure, unadulterated hatred. "Do not say another word to me, Richard. You conspired to steal my money, and you tried to frame Jocelyn to hide your own crimes. You are a complete fraud." The remaining relatives watched this physical confrontation in absolute stunned silence. Aunt Susan backed away slowly, putting as much distance between herself and Patricia as possible. Cousin Brittany covered her mouth, her eyes darting nervously toward the front door. The entire social fabric of the living room was completely disintegrating. My parents were completely isolated. Terence slowly released his grip on Richard's suit jacket, stepping back in sheer disgust. Richard slumped against the table, fixing his tie with shaking hands, his face completely defeated. Terence then slowly turned his massive frame around. He ignored my parents entirely now. His burning gaze locked directly onto the one person who had betrayed him the most. He was finally looking at Amanda. Terence slowly took his hands off my father's jacket and took a step back. The anger radiating off him was palpable, filling the room with a dangerous kind of energy. He didn't look at my mother, who was still gasping for air in her chair. He didn't look at my father, who was leaning against the table in defeat. He turned his attention entirely to his wife. Amanda was curled up in her folding chair, her knees pulled tight against her chest, refusing to meet his eyes. "Where is my money?" Amanda, Terence asked. His voice was low, terrifyingly calm compared to the yelling just moments ago. He walked slowly toward her, his heavy footsteps thudding against the hardwood floor. "Where is the $200,000 I spent 5 years saving?" Amanda began to cry again. Real tears this time, her makeup running down her face in messy black streaks. "Terence, please," she whimpered, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean to. It was a mistake. They promised me I would double it. I just wanted to give us a better life." Terence stopped a few feet away from her, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. "A mistake," he repeated, the word tasting like poison in his mouth. "A mistake is forgetting to pay a utility bill. A mistake is denting the car. Wiring our entire life savings to a fake cryptocurrency website is not a mistake. It is an absolute betrayal." Amanda reached out a trembling hand, trying to grab his arm, but he violently swatted it away. "Don't touch me!" Terence roared, his self-control finally snapping. "How did you think you were going to hide this from me?" "What was the plan, Amanda? Were you just going to let your parents steal from the family trust to cover your tracks? Were you going to let them frame your sister and send her to federal prison just so you wouldn't have to admit what you did?" Amanda sobbed harder, shaking her head frantically. "No, I didn't know they were going to do that," she cried. "I swear, Terence, I didn't know about framing Jocelyn. I just asked my mom for help. I was scared." I watched the exchange with a profound sense of clinical detachment. The psychological collapse of a fraudster is always a fascinating thing to observe. Amanda was still trying to play the victim, still trying to deflect the blame onto our parents, desperately clinging to whatever shred of innocence she could manufacture. Terrence wasn't buying it. His eyes darted toward the window, catching sight of the silver Porsche parked in the driveway. He turned back to Amanda, his expression hardening into pure, unadulterated suspicion. If the savings account was completely wiped out 3 years ago, he said, his voice dropping into a dangerous whisper, then how did you buy that car? Amanda froze. The crying stopped abruptly. She stared at him, her eyes wide with sheer panic. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She looked frantically at my parents, but they were both staring at the floor, utterly defeated. She had nowhere left to hide. I decided it was time to put her out of her misery. I uncrossed my legs and leaned forward in my chair. She didn't buy the Porsche with your bonus money, Terrence, I said, my voice echoing clearly across the silent living room. Terrence slowly turned his head to look at me, his eyes burning with desperate, fearful questions. Then how did she pay for it? He asked, his voice completely devoid of emotion. I pulled a second folder out of my briefcase, this one much thinner than my father's prop. I opened it and pulled out a single sheet of paper. I held it up for Terrence to see. She paid for the $40,000 down payment by taking out a high-interest predatory mortgage loan against the equity of your current home, I stated, delivering the cold, hard facts with the precision of a surgeon. Terrence stared at the paper in my hand, his face completely blank. What he whispered, Amanda forged your signature on the loan documents. I continued, my voice steady and unwavering. She used the equity you built up in your house over the last 7 years to secure a completely toxic variable rate loan. She used the first $40,000 to buy the Porsche, and she's been using the rest to fund her shopping habits and pay the minimum monthly balances on her massive credit card debt. The silence in the room was absolute. Terrence didn't yell, he didn't scream or throw anything. He just stood there, his massive shoulders slumping forward as the sheer magnitude of his financial ruin finally settled over him. The woman he loved, the woman he had fiercely defended just 30 minutes ago, had not only stolen his entire life savings, but she had also secretly mortgaged his home and forged his signature on predatory loans. He was completely irreversibly ruined. While Terrence stood frozen in the devastating reality of his destroyed marriage, a different kind of horror was slowly creeping across the rest of the living room. Up until this exact moment, the 22 relatives had viewed the audio recording primarily as a shocking piece of marital gossip. They had watched the spectacular collapse of the golden child with a mixture of morbid curiosity and profound discomfort. But as the silence stretched on, the deeper implications of my mother's recorded words finally began to penetrate their collective consciousness. The brainwashing was wearing off. The toxic spell that my parents had cast over this family for decades was rapidly dissolving, leaving behind a cold, harsh clarity. I watched the exact moment the realization hit Uncle Greg. He had retreated to the back of the circle when Terrence lunged at my father, but now he was stepping forward again. His physical appearance had drastically changed. The self-righteous indignation that had puffed out his chest just 30 minutes ago was completely gone. He looked 10 years older. His face was deeply lined, and his hands were trembling visibly at his sides. He walked slowly past the empty folding chairs, his boots scuffing heavily against the polished hardwood floor. He completely ignored Amanda, who was still sobbing on the rug. He bypassed Terrence entirely. His eyes were locked with a terrifying intensity solely on his brother Richard. Richard, Uncle Greg said, his voice cracking dryly in the quiet room. My father slowly lifted his head. He was still leaning heavily against the oak side table, looking like a cornered animal. Richard tried to quickly compose himself, attempting to smooth down his wrinkled suit jacket and stand up straight, but the effort was entirely pathetic. "What is it, Greg?" Richard asked, attempting to inject a tone of brotherly reassurance into his voice. "We will sort this all out. It is just a misunderstanding. We can fix this together as a family." Uncle Greg did not smile. He did not accept the reassurance. He took another step closer, closing the distance until he was standing just a few feet away from my father. On the recording, Uncle Greg continued, his voice rising slightly in volume. "You said you could just transfer $200,000 to cover Amanda's mistake. You said you were the sole manager of the family trust account, and that you completely controlled all the disbursements and the quarterly statements. You said you could move the money, and nobody would ever notice the difference." Richard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. "Greg, that was 3 years ago." Richard stammered, desperately trying to spin the narrative. "I was panicking. Patricia was panicking. We were just throwing out crazy ideas to save Amanda. I never actually touched the trust money. I swear to you, I never took a single dime from the family fund." The lie was so incredibly weak, it practically dissolved in the air the second it left his mouth. Uncle Greg shook his head slowly, a look of profound dread washing over his features. He turned slightly, looking back at Aunt Susan, Aunt Diane, and Cousin Brittany. The other relatives were standing up from their chairs, now drawn toward the confrontation like magnets. They were finally connecting the dots. If Richard had the unilateral power to secretly move $200,000 3 years ago to save his favorite daughter, what else had he done with their money over the last decade? Tonight was the final maturation date, Uncle Greg said, turning his burning gaze back to Richard. "You invited all 22 of us here tonight specifically to celebrate. You stood in the middle of this room 10 minutes ago and proudly announced that you were going to disperse exactly $4 million to the beneficiaries at midnight tonight. You used that money as a weapon to force Jocelyn to sign a legal contract." Uncle Greg took one final aggressive step forward, pointing a trembling finger directly at my father's chest. "So I am asking you a very simple question, Richard. If you had the power to steal $200,000 and you were willing to frame your own daughter for a federal crime just to cover it up, what happened to the rest of the money?" Uncle Greg's voice escalated into a booming, desperate shout that echoed off the high ceilings. "Where is the $4 million, Richard? Where is our money?" The question hung in the air like a lit match in a room full of gasoline. The relatives gasped collectively, the sheer magnitude of their potential financial loss hitting them like a physical blow. Aunt Susan grabbed the back of her chair, her knees buckling slightly. Cousin Brittany let out a sharp, terrified cry. The mob mentality instantly, violently reversed direction. The 22 people who had gathered to destroy me for being selfish suddenly realized they had just spent the last 30 minutes violently defending the very man who had robbed them, entirely blind. The circle of relatives began to physically close in around my father. The folding chairs were knocked aside as aunts, uncles, and cousins surged forward, their faces twisted with a terrifying mixture of greed and absolute panic. They were no longer a polite family gathered for the holidays. They were an angry, desperate mob demanding answers. Aunt Diane pushed her way to the front, standing right next to Uncle Greg. "Show us the bank statements right now, Richard," she demanded, her voice shrill and hysterical. "Log into the trust account on your phone and show us the $4 million. If the money is there, show it to us right now." Richard backed away until his spine hit the wall behind the oak table. He looked left and right, but there was absolutely no escape. He was completely surrounded by the people he had sworn to protect. I watched my father press his back against the oak-side table, his eyes darting frantically as the mob of relatives closed in around him. Aunt Diane was practically screaming in his face, demanding that he open his banking application right then and there. I decided to put an end to the chaotic shouting. I placed my smartphone back into my tailored suit jacket pocket and slowly stood up from my wooden chair. "Stop yelling at him, Aunt Diane," I said. My voice was not loud, but the sheer professional authority in my tone immediately silenced the room. The relatives slowly turned around to look at me. Looking at the banking application on his smartphone will not give you the answers you are desperately looking for right now, no matter how much you scream at him. Because the trust account balance is currently 0 and has been for months. Uncle Greg whipped his head around to face me. "0!" he gasped, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "What do you mean 0, Jocelyn? The trust was worth $4 million. I stepped forward, walking calmly into the open space between the angry relatives and my terrified parents. I mean exactly what I said, Uncle Greg. The $4 million is completely gone. When I first heard the recording of my mother suggesting they steal from the trust 3 years ago, I did not just sit on that information. I am a licensed forensic accountant. I specialize in tracking hidden offshore assets and uncovering complex corporate embezzlement. So I quietly initiated a comprehensive independent audit of the grandfather family trust using public tax filings and cross-referenced financial records associated with my father's management firm. I turned to look directly at Richard. He was staring at me with a look of absolute sheer horror, realizing that his entire hidden financial life had been meticulously dissected by his own daughter. My father did not just take $200,000 to cover Amanda's cryptocurrency scam, I explained to the room, utilizing precise professional accounting terminology. That initial theft was just the catalyst. Once Richard realized how incredibly easy it was to bypass the beneficiary oversight protocols, he simply never stopped stealing. He engaged in a highly calculated 3-year financial shell game to systematically drain the entire trust. How did he do it? Aunt Susan asked, her voice trembling with rising panic. How do you hide $4 million from the Internal Revenue Service? He utilized a technique known as structuring, I answered, keeping my delivery clinical and entirely devoid of emotion. He purposefully kept the illicit cash withdrawals strictly under the federal reporting threshold to avoid triggering automatic Bank Secrecy Act alerts. But pulling cash out directly is far too risky. So Richard established 3 separate dummy limited liability companies registered in the state of Delaware, where corporate ownership can remain anonymous. I paced slowly in front of my father, listing off his crimes, like a federal prosecutor reading a devastating indictment. He categorized these dummy corporations as property management and financial consulting firms. Then, as the sole legal manager of the trust, he began issuing fraudulent vendor invoices to those shell companies for phantom administrative services and fabricated capital expenditures. The trust was paying for repairs on properties that did not even exist. The money was seamlessly wired out of the trust account directly into the shell companies, and from there it was entirely commingled with Richard and Patricia's personal private checking accounts. Uncle Greg grabbed his own hair, looking like he was about to physically collapse. But where did the money actually go? Greg demanded. $4 million does not just vanish into thin air, Jocelyn. I gestured broadly to the incredibly lavish rooms surrounding us. It did not vanish, Uncle Greg. You are standing in it. Look around you right now. Look at the $4,000 Bose surround sound system we just used to expose them. Look at Patricia's closet full of authentic luxury cashmere and imported designer handbags. Look at the custom-tailored suits Richard wears to his exclusive country club. They used your rightful inheritance to aggressively fund a hyper-inflated luxury lifestyle they could never actually afford on their own legitimate income. I turned my gaze back toward Amanda, who was still crying silently on the floor. And of course, a massive portion of the embezzled trust funds went directly toward maintaining the grand illusion of the perfect golden child. Richard used the stolen family money to systematically pay off the exorbitant minimum monthly balances on Amanda's maxed-out credit cards. He funded her luxury weekend vacations. He subsidized her expensive designer wardrobe so she could pretend to be incredibly wealthy while secretly drowning in high-interest debt directly behind Terrence's back. They bled the family trust completely dry to finance their own ridiculous arrogance. I stopped pacing and stood perfectly still, letting the undeniable heavy weight of the forensic evidence crush any remaining sliver of hope in the room. There is no midnight disbursement happening tonight, I stated with absolute chilling finality, looking directly into Uncle Greg's terrified eyes. The family trust is completely and totally insolvent. The $4 million is officially gone. Richard and Patricia have spent every single penny, leaving nothing behind for anyone else. The absolute finality of my statement hung in the air for a fraction of a second before the entire living room exploded into pure, unadulterated chaos. The thin veneer of polite high society family behavior completely shattered into pieces. 22 people erupted into a deafening chorus of screams, furious shouts, and hysterical crying. Uncle Greg lunged forward, grabbing Richard by the lapels of his expensive tailored suit, shaking him violently against the oak-side table. "Where is my retirement money?" Richard Uncle Greg roared, his face turning a dark shade of purple. Aunt Diane was right behind him, pounding her fists against Richard's chest, demanding her share of the $4 million. Cousin Brittany collapsed into her folding chair, sobbing loudly about her massive student loans that were supposed to be paid off tonight. The sheer volume of the noise was physically painful, echoing off the high ceilings and vibrating through the floorboards. They were no longer a family. They were a mob of incredibly angry victims, realizing they had been completely robbed blind by the man they trusted most. Patricia finally snapped out of her catatonic state. Seeing her husband being physically assaulted by his own brother shook her back to reality. She pushed herself up from her chair, stumbling forward into the violent, chaotic center of the room. "Stop it!" Patricia screamed, waving her arms frantically in the air. "Greg, let him go right now. Please, everybody, just calm down. We can fix this. We can explain everything." But nobody was listening to her anymore. The relatives who had blindly followed her orders to attack me just an hour ago were now turning their full aggressive fury directly onto her. Aunt Susan turned away from Richard and marched right up to my mother, her face twisted with absolute disgust. "Fix it!" Aunt Susan spat, her voice shrill and piercing. "How do you fix $4 million stolen dollars, Patricia? Are you going to sell your designer handbags to pay for my daughter's college tuition?" Patricia backed away, her hands raised in a desperate, pleading gesture. "It is just a temporary cash flow issue," Patricia lied desperately, her voice shaking with terror. "We have the house. We have assets. We will pay everyone back, every single penny, I swear it. Just please calm down and let us talk like a civilized family." Her words were completely useless. The relatives screamed louder, drowning out her pathetic excuses. I stood completely still in the middle of the raging storm, watching the family ecosystem completely devour itself. They were tearing each other apart like starving animals, and I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, profound sense of closure. I had spent my entire life trying to prove my worth to these people. I had endured decades of being the scapegoat, the outcast, the selfish daughter who never quite fit into their perfect toxic mold. But watching them now, I realized I was incredibly lucky to have never fit in with their madness. I slowly reached down and picked up my heavy wool winter coat from the back of the empty wooden chair. I slid my arms into the sleeves, pulling the thick, expensive fabric elegantly over my shoulders. I adjusted the collar, taking my time, moving with deliberate calm, while the screaming match raged on entirely out of control just a few feet away from me. I smoothed down my skirt and picked up my designer handbag, feeling completely detached from the sheer panic consuming the room. Every movement I made was a silent declaration of my complete and total independence from their toxic web. I walked slowly toward the front entrance of the massive living room. My designer heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor, but the sound was completely swallowed by the chaotic shouting. I stopped just at the edge of the carpet and turned around to look at them one last time. I needed to ensure my departure was as definitive and permanently damaging as the crimes they committed against me. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the heavy, tense air, and I clapped my hands together twice. The sharp, cracking sound was loud enough to momentarily slice right through the hysterical screaming. Several relatives turned their heads to look at me. Uncle Greg stopped shaking Richard. Patricia froze mid-sentence. The room grew just quiet enough for my voice to carry perfectly across the space. "You all gathered here tonight to hold me accountable," I said, my voice projecting with cold, unwavering authority over the 22 people who had just tried to completely destroy my life. "You demanded justice. You demanded financial restitution. Well, you finally found the real thieves." I looked directly into my mother's terrified eyes and then shifted my gaze to my defeated father. "I have given you the forensic evidence. I have given you the exact truth." I paused, letting the terrifying reality of their situation settle over the silent room. Now I suggest you call your lawyers. Uncle Greg dropped his hands from my father's suit jacket. He took a slow step backward, his chest heaving as he processed my words. Lawyers. Uncle Greg repeated his voice barely a whisper above the ringing silence that had suddenly engulfed the entire room. Why do we need lawyers, Jocelyn? My father immediately seized the opportunity. He pushed himself off the oak table, holding up his hands in surrender. You do not need lawyers, Richard pleaded desperately, his voice cracking. She is just trying to scare you. This is a family matter. We can handle this internally without legal counsel. It will only drain whatever money we have left. I looked at my father with pity. There is no internal family matter left to handle, Richard, I said, completely devoid of sympathy. Do you honestly think I sat on that audio recording for 3 years, just waiting for a dramatic moment to play it? Do you think I am that petty? I am a licensed forensic accountant. When I realized you were conspiring to steal from the trust and frame me for a federal crime, I went to work. I spent the last 36 months legally auditing every aspect of this family's financial history. I pulled public property records and state tax filings. I tracked the registration numbers of your Delaware shell companies and cross-referenced every fraudulent vendor invoice. Patricia let out a horrible strangling sound. She slumped further into her folding chair, clutching her chest as if she could not breathe. I ignored her completely, turning my attention back to the crowd of relatives. The manila folder my father tried to use to blackmail me tonight was filled with completely fabricated nonsense, I explained smoothly. But the folder I created is absolutely real. It is a highly detailed, meticulously indexed 500-page dossier. It contains every single bank statement, every wire transfer receipt, and digital communication proving exactly how Richard and Patricia systematically embezzled $4 million from their own relatives. It proves the tax fraud structuring and everything else. Uncle Greg stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. Where is this dossier? Greg asked, his voice trembling violently. Where did you put it, Jocelyn? I checked my gold Cartier watch again, a gesture that was no longer polite, but entirely lethal. Exactly 10 minutes before I walked through those front doors tonight, I sat in my car in your driveway, I replied, looking directly at my parents. I opened my encrypted laptop and I hit send on a highly secure email. I did not send it to a local police officer. I sent the entire 500-page dossier directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. The collective gasp from the room was so sharp, it sounded like all 22 people had been physically struck at the same time. The IRS. Aunt Susan whimpered, collapsing into the nearest chair. Oh my God, Richard, you brought the IRS into this. Yes, Susan, I answered for him. And the federal government does not care about your holiday traditions or family interventions. They only care about wire fraud and massive tax evasion. When Richard transferred $4 million into his private accounts, he did not declare a single penny as income. The IRS is going to freeze every single bank account associated with this family by tomorrow morning. They will seize this massive house. They will auction off the cars, the jewelry, the designer clothing, and every luxury item purchased with stolen trust funds to satisfy the incredible tax debt. There is absolutely no escaping a federal audit when the complete roadmap to your crimes has been perfectly highlighted and delivered straight to their desks. Richard let out a pathetic, guttural wail and slid down the wall until he was sitting on the hardwood floor holding his head in his hands. You see, Richard, I continued, my voice echoing with finality. You tried to threaten me with a fake prison sentence to steal my inheritance. But the dossier I handed over carries real mandatory minimums. Wire fraud alone carries up to 20 years in federal prison. Tax evasion adds another 5. You are going to a maximum security federal penitentiary. The federal agents will comb through every transaction. They will see exactly how Amanda bypassed security checks to illegally borrow against her house. Terrence will not spend a single dime on a private investigator to prove his wife is a complete fraud. The government will do the heavy lifting for him completely free of charge. Terrence stood tall, crossing his arms and glaring down at Amanda, who was hyperventilating so hard she looked like she might pass out. The reality of a federal investigation is a highly unique type of terror. It completely overrides any lingering sense of familial loyalty or social decorum. As soon as the words Internal Revenue Service and Federal Bureau of Investigation fully registered in the minds of the 22 relatives, the living room instantly transformed from an angry mob into a chaotic stampede for pure survival. Nobody cared about the missing $4 million anymore. They only cared about saving themselves from being dragged down in a massive federal criminal conspiracy. Uncle Greg was the first to completely break. He took one final terrified look at my father, sitting helplessly on the floor, and aggressively backed away, as if Richard was suddenly highly radioactive. "I need to call my attorney right now," Uncle Greg stammered, his voice pitching into a high hysterical register. "I have absolutely nothing to do with this, Richard. I swear to God I did not know anything about those offshore shell companies." Greg turned sharply and sprinted toward the hallway, entirely abandoning his wife, Aunt Diane, who was struggling to grab her leather purse from beneath a violently tipped-over metal folding chair. The sudden frantic movement from Uncle Greg immediately broke the invisible dam holding the rest of the relatives back. Utter pandemonium erupted across the living room. It was a mass exodus driven entirely by pure, unadulterated self-preservation. Metal folding chairs crashed loudly against the polished hardwood floor as aunts, uncles, and cousins frantically scrambled to get out of the room. Aunt Susan shoved Cousin Brittany hard against the wall just to get to the hallway coat rack first, snatching her expensive jacket and rushing toward the heavy oak double doors without even bothering to put it on. "Wait for me, Mom!" Brittany shrieked loudly, tripping over a discarded holiday gift bag as she chased desperately after her mother. The deafening noise of the stampede was a chaotic symphony of panicked breathing, scuffling expensive shoes, and slamming doors. They were literally physically pushing each other out of the way, desperate to put as much physical distance as possible between themselves and the massive federal crime scene this house had suddenly become. Nobody stopped to check on Patricia. Nobody offered Richard a helping hand. They fled with terrifying urgency, escaping a burning building. Within exactly 2 minutes, the entire suffocating crowd of 22 angry relatives had completely vanished from the property. The massive luxury living room felt suddenly hollow, the air thick with the dust kicked up by their frantic, desperate departure. The only people left standing in the wreckage were my parents, Amanda Terrence, and me. The front door stood wide open at the end of the hall, letting the freezing December wind howl directly into the grand entryway. Terrence had not moved a single inch during the entire chaotic stampede. He stood like a massive stone statue in the center of the Persian rug, staring down at his weeping wife. Amanda was still curled awkwardly on the floor, gasping for air, her hands reaching up toward him in a pathetic, desperate plea for mercy. "Terrence, please!" Amanda choked out her voice, barely a whisper through her violent sobbing. "Please do not leave me here. I will do anything you want. We can fix this together." Terrence looked at her with a cold, completely dead expression. There was absolutely no anger left in his dark eyes anymore. The fiery outrage from earlier had completely burned out. The intense rage had evaporated, leaving behind nothing but an absolute freezing void of disgust. "You do not exist to me anymore," Terrence stated, his deep voice entirely devoid of any human emotion. He slowly raised his left hand up into the air. He grasped the thick gold wedding band resting firmly on his ring finger and pulled it off in one smooth, highly deliberate motion. He did not yell or throw it at her face in a sudden fit of rage. He simply held the ring over her trembling form and let it drop. The heavy gold band hit the polished hardwood floor with a sharp metallic clink that echoed loudly in the newly emptied room. It rolled slowly in a small, tight circle before coming to a complete stop right next to Amanda's knee. Terrence turned his broad back to her and walked away. His heavy footsteps echoed with absolute finality as he marched straight toward the open front door. He did not look back. He did not hesitate for a second. He walked out into the freezing winter night and slammed the heavy oak double doors completely shut. Amanda let out an agonizing scream, collapsing against the floor. The masterminds of this family intervention were finally left alone with the devastating consequences of their actions. The heavy oak double doors slammed shut, entirely sealing off the chaos of the outside world. The sudden silence that fell over the massive living room was not peaceful. It was a suffocating graveyard silence, the kind that only follows the absolute destruction of something that can never be rebuilt. I stood perfectly still near the entryway, my heavy wool winter coat resting warmly on my shoulders, my designer handbag gripped loosely in my right hand. I surveyed the absolute wreckage of my family. The 22 folding chairs that had once formed a terrifying circle of judgment were now violently knocked aside, scattered haphazardly across the expensive Persian rug. The $4,000 Bose surround sound system remained completely silent, its job permanently finished. Amanda was still curled into a tight ball on the hardwood floor near where Terrence had dropped his wedding ring. The golden child was entirely broken. Her hysterical sobbing had devolved into a series of pathetic wet gasps. She was gripping her own hair, her face pressed against the floor, entirely unable to process the terrifying reality that her husband was gone. Her money was gone, and she was about to face a massive federal investigation entirely alone. She did not even look up at our parents. The carefully constructed illusion of her perfect innocent life had completely dissolved, leaving behind nothing but a scared, incredibly selfish adult who had finally run out of lies to hide behind. My father Richard was equally paralyzed. He was still sitting exactly where he had slumped against the wall, the prop manila folder lying entirely forgotten near his expensive dress shoes. He was staring blankly at the antique mahogany grandfather clock in the hallway, but his eyes were completely unfocused. He was a man who had spent his entire life building a towering fortress of financial superiority and arrogant authority. Now that fortress had completely collapsed, burying him under the crushing weight of his own criminal greed. He knew the Internal Revenue Service did not negotiate with embezzlers. He knew the Federal Bureau of Investigation did not care about his country club membership. He was calculating the years he would spend in a maximum security federal penitentiary, and the sheer terror of that realization had entirely short-circuited his brain. He was completely unresponsive. It was my mother, Patricia, who finally broke the heavy silence. She pushed herself up from her metal folding chair, her movements jerky and incredibly uncoordinated. Her expensive cashmere sweater was wrinkled. Her perfectly styled hair was a complete mess, and the malicious, triumphant sneer she had worn just 30 minutes ago was entirely gone. She stumbled blindly across the Persian rug, stepping over a discarded folding chair, completely ignoring Amanda sobbing on the floor. She moved directly toward me, her eyes wide with a desperate, animalistic panic. She reached out with both hands, her fingers trembling violently. Before I could step back, Patricia collapsed heavily onto her knees right in front of me. She reached up and grabbed the hem of my heavy wool winter coat, her knuckles turning completely white from the sheer force of her desperate grip. "Jocelyn!" Patricia choked out, her voice sounding like tearing paper. "Jocelyn, you have to stop this. You have to recall the email right now. Please tell me you can cancel it. Tell me you can unsend the dossier." I looked down at the woman who had birthed me. I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life telling me I was selfish, ungrateful, and entirely unworthy of her love. I looked at the woman who had actively conspired to frame me for a massive federal crime just an hour ago to protect the daughter she actually loved. And I felt absolutely nothing. There was no lingering anger. There was no profound sadness. There was just a cold, incredibly deep sense of finality. "I cannot unsend an encrypted email to a federal agency." "Patricia," I replied, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "It does not work like that." The moment I hit send, the data was permanently logged onto their secure servers. The investigation has already begun. There is absolutely no stopping it now. Patricia let out a horrifying high-pitched wail. She gripped my coat harder, shaking it violently, as if she could physically force the federal government to disappear. No, she screamed, her face contorted in pure absolute terror. You are our daughter. You cannot do this to us. We are your family, Jocelyn. We gave you life. We raised you. Family forgives family. You cannot send your own father to federal prison. You cannot let them take our house. You have to call them and tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you made the whole thing up. Tell them you were just angry and you fabricated the audit. She was begging me to commit perjury to save her from the consequences of her own massive crimes. She was still actively trying to use me as her ultimate shield, completely blind to the fact that I had just spent the last hour dismantling her entire world. She genuinely believed that the toxic bond of family was somehow stronger than a federal wire fraud indictment. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face, entirely expecting me to finally break and rescue her. I looked down into my mother's tear-filled eyes and saw absolutely nothing but a desperate reflection of her own incredibly selfish panic. She was not crying because she realized she had deeply hurt her daughter. She was crying solely because she had finally been caught, and the impending consequences of her massive financial crimes were entirely inescapable. I did not reach down to help her up from the floor. I did not bend my knees to meet her at her level. I simply stood incredibly tall, letting the heavy weight of my wool winter coat settle comfortably on my shoulders, as I prepared to deliver the absolute final words I would ever speak to her. "You want to talk to me about family?" "Patricia?" I asked, my voice echoing with cold, piercing clarity in the silent room. "You want to kneel on this Persian rug and invoke the sacred bond of blood after you just spent 30 minutes actively trying to destroy my life?" I slowly shook my head, disgusted by her sheer audacity. Family is supposed to be a sanctuary. Family is supposed to be the one place where you are fiercely protected from harm. It is not supposed to be a hunting ground. You do not get to use the word family as a convenient shield only when your own malicious actions finally catch up with you. Patricia let out another pathetic sob, gripping the hem of my coat tighter, but I easily stepped back, forcing her hands to drop uselessly to her sides. For 34 years, I continued my tone completely devoid of any yelling. I let you and Richard convince me that I was the fundamental problem in this household. I let you tell me I was too cold, too focused on my career, and too selfish to be properly loved. You designated me as the permanent family scapegoat because you desperately needed a massive distraction from your own profound moral rot. You needed everyone to focus on my supposed flaws, so they would never notice that the perfect parents and the golden child were actually just greedy criminals bleeding the family trust completely dry. I paced one step to the right, putting myself directly in the path of the grand entryway. "You thought my independence was a weakness," I stated, looking back down at her trembling form. "You thought that because I did not rely on your money, I was somehow desperate for your emotional validation. You calculated that the terror of losing this toxic family would force me to blindly sign away $500,000. But you severely miscalculated the entire situation tonight. You forgot that my independence is exactly what gave me the ultimate power to completely walk away from your madness." I adjusted my designer handbag on my arm, feeling incredibly light. "You just told me that family forgives family," I said, letting a chilling smile touch my lips. "But I am not going to forgive you, Patricia. I am going to let the federal justice system do exactly what it was designed to do. I am going to let the Internal Revenue Service strip you of every luxury item you stole, and I am going to let a federal judge decide exactly how many years you and Richard will spend sitting in a concrete cell for committing massive wire fraud." I looked around the ruined living room, taking one final sweeping visual inventory of the utter destruction they had brought upon themselves. I looked at Amanda, still weeping uncontrollably in the fetal position, realizing she had absolutely no one left to manipulate anymore. I looked at Richard, still paralyzed against the wall, completely broken by the sudden loss of his wealth and his arrogant power. If my choice tonight is between being your sacrificial lamb or being entirely alone, the decision is incredibly easy. I declared my voice carrying the absolute weight of my newly established boundary. I would much rather spend this entire Christmas drinking a $500 bottle of champagne, completely alone in my pristine Chicago penthouse, than spend another single second serving as the designated scapegoat for a room full of pathetic, desperate criminals. I did not wait for a response. There was absolutely nothing left to say to any of them. I stepped smoothly right over my mother's legs as she remained completely frozen on the floor. I walked deliberately down the long hallway, my heels clicking rhythmically against the expensive tiles. I reached the heavy oak double doors and pushed them wide open. The freezing December wind blasted against my face, instantly waking me up. I stepped out onto the front porch, pulling my thick wool coat much tighter. I walked straight toward my car, leaving their toxic wreckage completely behind forever. 6 months later, the freezing winds of that December night had long since faded, replaced by the sweltering heat of a Chicago summer. But the fire I started in that living room had burned continuously until there was absolutely nothing left of my family's fraudulent empire. The federal government moves slowly, but when it finally strikes, it strikes with overwhelming and absolute force. The 500-page dossier I emailed from my car that night was a forensic masterpiece. It gave the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation a complete highlighted roadmap to $4 million in stolen funds. My parents did not even have a chance to mount a legitimate legal defense. When federal agents raided the sprawling Illinois suburban home 3 days after the Christmas intervention, Richard tried to bluff his way out of it using his country club charm. It did not work. The agents confiscated his computers, seized his financial ledgers, and froze every single bank account associated with his name and his Delaware shell companies. The sheer volume of the evidence was entirely undeniable. Richard and Patricia were indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy. Their expensive defense attorneys took one look at the forensic paper trail and immediately advised them to take a plea deal. The terrifying prospect of a prolonged public trial that would certainly end in a 20-year sentence broke their arrogant spirits completely. Last Tuesday, I sat quietly in the back row of a federal courtroom in downtown Chicago and watched my parents stand before a federal judge. They were no longer the impeccably dressed masters of the universe. Patricia wore a drab beige prison-issued jumpsuit, her dyed hair graying rapidly at the roots. Richard looked small and fragile, his shoulders hunched in absolute defeat. The judge showed zero leniency for white-collar criminals who aggressively steal from their own relatives. Richard and Patricia officially pleaded guilty to federal wire fraud. They were both sentenced to 10 years in a federal penitentiary. Furthermore, the IRS officially seized the luxury suburban house, auctioning it off to the highest bidder to satisfy the millions they owed in back taxes and court-ordered restitution. Their designer clothes, the $4,000 sound system, the luxury cars, everything was liquidated by the federal government. Uncle Greg and the other relatives did not attend the sentencing, abandoning my parents to their fate. While my parents were being crushed by the criminal justice system, Amanda was being systematically dismantled in family court. Terrence did not hesitate for a single second. He hired one of the most ruthless divorce attorneys in the state and filed the paperwork the very morning after the intervention. Because Amanda and Terrence did not have any children together, the divorce proceedings were entirely focused on the division of assets and liabilities. Normally, Illinois is an equitable distribution state, but Amanda had committed massive financial fraud against her own husband. She had secretly forged his signature to take out a predatory mortgage loan, and she had recklessly gambled away his $200,000 life savings on a completely fabricated cryptocurrency scam. Terrence subpoenaed the digital audio recording I had played at the family gathering and used it as the ultimate weapon in court. The family court judge listened to Amanda confessing to the massive theft and ruled entirely in Terrence's favor. He was awarded full ownership of his remaining retirement accounts, his entire corporate salary, and any remaining equity in the home. The judge then assigned the entirety of the predatory loan debt directly to Amanda. She was held personally and legally responsible for the massive high-interest debt she had fraudulently acquired behind her husband's back. Terrence walked away from the marriage completely clean-free to rebuild his life without the suffocating weight of her toxic lies pulling him down. Amanda was left with absolutely nothing. Her husband abandoned her. Her parents were locked away in federal prison, and the 22 relatives who used to adore her now viewed her with complete and utter disgust. Without Richard's stolen trust funds to pay her minimum monthly credit card balances, her manufactured wealthy lifestyle collapsed overnight. The luxury auto dealership repossessed the silver Porsche Panamera within 2 months because she could not make the payments. Drowning in the massive mortgage debt, the credit card bills, and the legal fees from the divorce, Amanda was completely backed into a corner. With zero income and absolutely no family safety net left to catch her, she had only one remaining legal option. Just 4 months after she sat in that living room and tried to steal my inheritance, the former golden child of the family was officially forced to file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy, destroying her future. The reality of total financial ruin is not a sudden explosion. It is a slow, grinding process that entirely strips away your dignity piece by piece. For Amanda, the destruction of her carefully curated world meant trading her luxury silver Porsche and expensive designer clothes for a heavily stained polyester uniform and a pair of cheap slip-resistant shoes. Her new kingdom was not a pristine suburban mansion or a high-end luxury boutique. It was a brightly lit 24-hour fast food diner located just off the interstate highway. The fluorescent lights buzzed loudly overhead, casting a harsh, sickly glow over the greasy linoleum floor. Instead of spending her evening sipping expensive wine and pretending to be a wealthy housewife, Amanda was now scheduled to work the grueling overnight shift from 10 in the evening until 6 in the morning. She spent her nights wiping down sticky tables, emptying overflowing trash cans, and scrubbing the thick grease off the industrial flat-top grill. The physical toll was absolute and entirely unforgiving. Every single movement was a brutal reminder of the incredible wealth she had foolishly thrown away. Her hands, once perfectly manicured and soft, were now cracked, peeling, and constantly smelling of cheap industrial bleach and stale frying oil. She spent 8 hours straight on her feet running back and forth across the slippery kitchen floor, fetching extra ketchup packets for rude truck drivers and drunken college students. There was absolutely no glamour here. Nobody cared about her carefully crafted sob stories or her tragic victim complex. The diner customers did not view her as a special golden child who deserved endless sympathy and financial support. They viewed her simply as a slow waitress who forgot to refill their coffee cups. When customers yelled at her for bringing the wrong order, she could not burst into fake tears and expect a wealthy husband to rush in and aggressively defend her honor. She just had to stand there, swallow her massive pride, and apologize repeatedly while they left her 0 tip on the table. The financial trap Amanda found herself in was entirely inescapable. While her Chapter 7 bankruptcy had wiped out her massive credit card debt, it absolutely did not protect her from the court-ordered restitution she was mandated to pay regarding the fraudulent loans. The federal judge had ensured that her victims would eventually be made whole. This meant that a significant portion of her meager minimum wage paycheck was automatically garnished by the state before she even saw it. She would work a completely exhausting 40-hour week, dealing with horrible customers and physical pain only to receive a direct deposit that barely covered her basic survival needs. She was living completely paycheck to paycheck, forced to carefully calculate every single penny she spent at the discount grocery store just to afford cheap ramen noodles and generic bread. The days of casual $1,000 shopping sprees on Michigan Avenue were permanently gone, replaced by the terrifying reality of hoping she had enough money left over to pay her basic electric bill. Her most powerful weapon had been completely neutralized. For her entire life, Amanda had survived by manipulating the emotions of everyone around her. She had used her fake crying and her exaggerated vulnerability to extract money, sympathy, and protection from her parents and her husband. But in the harsh reality of the fast food industry, Her tears were entirely useless currency. During her first week at the diner, she tried her old tactics on her shift manager. She let her eyes well up with tears and fed him a tragic story about her difficult divorce, hoping he would let her leave her shift early without penalty. The manager, a hardened man who had worked in restaurants for 20 years, simply stared at her blankly and told her that if she clocked out early, she would be permanently fired. He did not care about her manufactured trauma. He only cared about keeping the drive-through window moving. For the first time in her life, Amanda realized that nobody was coming to save her. She had absolutely no audience left to manipulate. When her grueling 8-hour shift finally ended as the sun began to rise, Amanda would walk entirely alone to the bus stop. She could not afford a car, so she had to rely on the unreliable public transit system to get her back to the tiny, rundown studio apartment she now rented on the bad side of town. The apartment was cramped, drafty, and smelled faintly of mildew. There was no $4,000 surround sound system to play music. There were no cashmere sweaters in the tiny closet. She would lock the thin wooden door, peel off her greasy uniform, and stand in front of the small, cracked mirror hanging above the bathroom sink. The woman staring back at her was completely unrecognizable. The arrogant, entitled golden child was completely dead. She was now just another exhausted, invisible face, trapped in a relentless cycle of manual labor and crushing debt, paying the ultimate price for a lifetime of incredible greed and highly calculated deception. While Amanda was scraping thick grease off flat-top grills, I was busy ascending to the absolute pinnacle of my career. The contrast could not have been more perfectly poetic. My parents had spent my entire life telling me that my intense dedication to my profession was a severe character flaw. They called me cold, they called me selfish. But the meticulous attention to detail that they hated so much was exactly what saved my life and completely destroyed their fraudulent empire. The elite forensic accounting skills I used to dissect Richard's Delaware shell companies were the exact same skills that caught the immediate attention of the senior executive partners at my firm. The federal indictment of my parents made massive headlines across the Chicago financial sector. Instead of viewing the family scandal as a professional liability, the executive board at my Big Four accounting firm viewed my direct actions as the ultimate display of unshakable integrity. I had ruthlessly audited my own flesh and blood and handed them over to the federal government without a single moment of hesitation. That is the kind of fierce objectivity you simply cannot teach in a corporate training seminar. In early March, they called me into the main glass-walled boardroom, overlooking the Chicago River. They did not just offer me a standard annual raise or a minor title bump. They officially promoted me to managing director, making me one of the youngest women in the entire history of the firm to hold that incredibly prestigious title. My new office is twice the size of my old one. My new compensation package makes the $500,000 inheritance my father tried to violently extort from me look like absolute pocket change. I earned every single penny of it through legitimate, grueling hard work, entirely free of backdoor trust fund embezzlement or predatory loans. The massive financial upgrade allowed me to completely reshape my physical environment. I moved out of my luxury high-rise apartment and purchased a sprawling multi-million-dollar penthouse directly in the heart of downtown Chicago. The space is absolutely pristine. It features floor-to-ceiling glass windows, massive open-concept living areas, and completely zero-metal folding chairs. It is a fortress of absolute peace. Tonight, the bitter December chill has returned to the city. I am standing out on my private wraparound balcony, leaning against the thick frosted glass railing. The wind is biting, but I barely feel it. The sprawling illuminated skyline of Chicago stretches out endlessly in front of me, a glittering ocean of glass and steel against the pitch-black sky. Down below, millions of people are rushing through the crowded streets, fighting their own battles and navigating their own highly complicated lives. But up here, the silence is absolutely perfect. I am wearing a thick cashmere sweater that I bought with my own legitimate salary. I am holding a crystal flute filled with exactly the kind of $500 vintage champagne I promised my mother I would be drinking. I take a slow, deliberate sip. The crisp bubbles hit the back of my throat, tasting exactly like total absolute freedom. There are no frantic phone calls from Aunt Susan begging for a quick loan. There are no passive-aggressive text messages from my mother criticizing my lifestyle choices. There is no Amanda sobbing hysterically on my couch demanding that I fix the massive disasters she created with her own greed. The toxic heavy chain that had been wrapped tightly around my neck for 34 years has been completely and permanently severed. I am the ultimate villain in their heavily fabricated narrative, but I am the absolute, undisputed hero of my own reality. I do not lose a single ounce of sleep over the fact that Richard and Patricia are sitting in concrete cells tonight. They built their own cages. I just handed the government the key. I lower the crystal flute and look directly out into the freezing night air. Then I turn my gaze slowly away from the glittering city skyline and look directly at you. Yes, you. The person who has been sitting there quietly listening to every single detail of this absolute nightmare. You have heard the furious screams. You have seen the blatant emotional manipulation. You have witnessed the spectacular destruction of a toxic family that prioritized the shallow illusion of wealth over basic human decency. But I know for an absolute fact that I am not the only one who has had to make this incredibly difficult choice. There are master manipulators and financial parasites hiding in family trees all over the world, completely destroying the people who love them most. So I have a very simple question for you before I go back inside and finish this incredibly expensive bottle of champagne. Have you ever had to let the law handle toxic family members? Tell me your story in the comments.